Udah masuk. Gimana caranya nih? Sekarang dong. Malah ngejak main. Gimana ya? Yoman, oke oke. Kedengaran nggak? Halo halo. Kelihatan nggak aplikasinya? Kelihatan nggak bu? Ini apa caranya ngecek yang pas lagi streaming nih? Hmm, oke oke. Ah ya wis lah. Pokok belajar. Udah makan, sudah minum obat ibu? Belum. Oke. Unity tutorial. Kalau ada chat kok nggak ada bunyi ya? Susah juga kalau gitu ya.
If you want to make a video game but don't know where to start, this video should help point you in the right direction. Making games is a complicated subject.
Oke, kemarin itu sampai kamera follow.
In this video, we'll have a look at making our camera follow the movement of our player. Not really much to say about that, let's just jump into it. So as with everything else in game development, making the camera follow the player can be done in multiple ways. The first and most obvious one is probably just parenting the camera to the player. Unity allows us to nest game objects. That means that we can take our camera here selected and drag it under our player.
Ini kamera. Oh, kemarin sudah aku transform kok. Oh iya. Oh iya. Eh, udah. Coba collision.
In this video, we're going to have a look at creating obstacles and how to make things happen when two objects collide. Also, before we jump into the tutorial, I have a quick update for you guys. I'm really glad the feedback on this series has been so positive so far. I'm having a blast making it. If you don't follow me on social media, when you're watching this video, I'm actually on my first vacation for a very long time. Because of that, the recent videos and the next ones are all scheduled. I really tried to fit in all of the blanks while I was gone, but unfortunately I had to skip a video. That means that this Wednesday there will be no new video. However, there will of course be another how to make a video game this Sunday. Alright, enough rambling, let's get started. So if we select our player, we can see that we currently have a player movement script.
Okay.
And we could definitely go ahead and add our collision code to this script as well. But to make things easier to understand, let's go ahead and create a separate script. Let's hit add component and let's call it something like player collision. Hit new script, select C# and hit create and add. Let's double click the script to
We can player component script here collision.
Open it up in Visual Studio, let's delete the two using tags up here and both the start and the update method. So adding code to colliding objects in Unity is actually really easy to do. Just like start and update, Unity has created a function with a specific name that is called whenever two objects collide. Let's write void just as we would do with start and update, and then write on collision enter. Make sure to use capital letters the same way that I do, and that you spell this in the right way. If you do this wrong, Unity is not going to throw an error, it's not going to complain in any way, but it's just not going to be working. We can then open and close some parentheses and some curly brackets. This now means that whatever code we place within these two curly brackets will be called whenever this object collides with something. So if we save this and
collision enter. Oh iya benar. Belum ding. Create dulu.
go back into Unity, we can add our player collision script to whatever object we want. As long as the object has a rigid body and a collider, we can be sure that this code will be called. So to test this, let's just go ahead and throw a debug.log statement that says we hit something. Let's save this, go into Unity and
Coba di lock ya. Hip something. Terus ke sini. Ini di duplicate. Dia ada rigid, ada player positioning. Oh, ada forward force-nya juga. Di delete. Terus di object cube. Gimana sih? Kok maju, turun. Terus dia box collider. Amat. Coba create material deh. Material 1. Warnamu hitam. Oke. Terus scale. Oke. Taruh sini. Hit something kok 2 kali. Sekali lagi. Oh, hit something soalnya dia nah jatuh. Collide bakal ngehit 2 kali. Hit. Hit. Nice. Oke. Gimana tadi?
And hit play, and you can see now that right off the gate a message displays in our console saying that we hit something. And you might think that's a bit weird because we don't currently have any obstacles in our scene, but Unity detects collision between all objects. So what we actually hit here is the ground. So when we hit play and our player falls down, this message is displayed. So let's try and add an obstacle to our scene. We can go over here in the hierarchy, right click, go 3D object and then cube. We can then reset the transform of this object. Let's move it forward a bit. Let's put it at 1 on the y-axis. Hit F to focus on it, and we can see that it's standing on our ground. It's currently totally white, so let's go into our project panel, right click, go create, material, and this is
Persis
going to
tadi.
be our obstacle mat. We can
Oh ya,
make this
obstacle.
a bit darker, and we can drag it onto our obstacle. We can also consider turning down the smoothness. You will notice the preview down here changing. The higher the smoothness, the more light will bounce off the surface. Let's just leave that at 0. We can now take this cube, move it forward a bit more, and give it a scale on the x-axis of about 2. We can rename it to something like obstacle, and you will notice this right away has a box collider. So all we need to do is add a rigid body as well. We can go ahead and increase the mass a tiny bit. This is a bit bigger than the cube, so let's set it to something like 2. And that should be all the settings we need to configure. Now if we go to our console, clear all the stuff we have in it, and hit play, we should see that we both collide with the ground and the obstacle object. However, we need a way of keeping track of what we hit, because we don't want this to trigger whenever we hit the ground.
Oh, soalnya nggak rigid body. Rigid body. Terus apa tadi? Mana tadi rigid body? Kamu ditambah rigid body. Masnya tambah 3. Jadi 2 terus. Apa tadi?
And the obstacle object we have in it, that should be all the settings we need to configure. Now bigger than the cube, so let's set it to as well. We can go ahead, right away has a box collider. We can rename it to something forward a bit, will bounce off the surface.
Oh, di materialnya. Di materialnya itu bisa bikin smoothness. Kalau semakin smooth, coba di rename dulu deh. Jenengnya apa bang? Obstacle map. Terus buat playernya, forward force-nya jadi sini, kasih sini. Terus player, forward force-nya jadi 1000. Tes. Tuh, weh. Oke. Lagi. Tuh. Oke, kalau misal dia itu smoothness-nya 0,9. Oh, semakin licin. Semakin licin. Oke.
let's just leave that at 0. We can now take this cube, move it forward a bit more, and give it a scale on the x-axis of about 2. We can rename it to something like obstacle, and you will notice this right away has a box collider. So all we need to do is add a rigid body as well. We can go ahead and increase the mass a tiny bit. This is a bit bigger than the cube, so let's set it to something like 2. And that should be all the settings we need to configure. Now if we go to our console, clear all the stuff we have in it, and hit play, we should see that we both collide with the ground and the obstacle object. However, we need a way of keeping track of what we hit, because we don't want this to trigger whenever we hit the ground. To do that, we go into our script and we tell Unity we want some information about what object we hit. We can do that by inserting a bit of code within these two parentheses. Let's write collision. This lets Unity know that we want to gather some information
Okay.
about the collision, and then we need to give that information a name. Again, we can choose any name we want here. I'm just going to type collision info. Then down here, instead of simply writing we hit something, let's display what we hit. To do that, we can replace our text with collision info. We then use the dot to access different parts of this information. You can see that we can get information about the contact points between the colliders, stuff like the impact force sum, and other handy parameters. The most important one for us is that we can get info about the collider we hit. So let's write dot collider, and again we can type dot and we'll get all of the information about that collider. Here we can access the rigid body of our collider, the material of our collider, or just display its name. So by accessing the collider within collision info and the name
Question does not contain definition of our name. Name accepting.
within the collider.
Oh, collider name. Sorry. Oke, masuk. Collider ground, collider cubeness.
We should now display the name of whatever we hit. Let's see if this works in Unity. So let's hit play, and we should see that it first shows ground and then obstacle. This makes it really easy for us to have different stuff happen depending on what we hit. We could write if collisioninfo.collider.name is equal to obstacle, and remember to put this within quotation marks. Let's then open and close the curly brackets, and now everything we write within these two curly brackets will only happen if the name of the collider that we hit is obstacle. Let's see if that works. Let's write a debug.log statement here saying we hit an obstacle. Again, let's save this, head back into Unity and hit play, and you can see nothing happens when we hit the ground. It actually displayed 2i, but Unity actually detected it. That checking if we have hundreds if not thousands means that if we were way to go about the case, we could mark this tag and then add a new one, object, and change the tag to obstacle. Then in our code, instead of checking for the name, we'll check for tag. This is obstacle. Let's call this one obstacle. We can then add a new one, hit the plus sign to create a new entry. We go up here where it says tag, we click untag. And you can see the different tags created by Unity automatically. We need to go ahead and add a new one, hit the plus sign to create a new entry, and let's call this one obstacle. We can then select our obstacle object and change the tag to obstacle. Then in our code, instead of checking for the name, we'll check for tag.
Oke, ini dikasih tag obstacle. Terus Pakai petik dua ya. Error nggak? Direct tar. Oh iya. Stop. Ada medali nggak gini? Taruh ya. Suruh.
This is much better because it allows us to create a bunch of different objects, and as long as they share the same tag, we can configure them in any way we want. So let's
Ya,
just make
masuk
sure that
akal.
this is working by hitting play, and indeed it is. Of course, displaying a message in the console isn't very exciting. What you should probably do is add some kind of end screen, or maybe just restart the level. Those are great things to add, but it's enough for a separate video. Instead, let's make sure to disable our player's movement, because right now when we hit the object, we actually just keep flying. Instead, we can simply go in through script and turn off our player movement script. To do that, we need to have a reference to our player movement script. Let's go into Visual Studio, and before our function, let's add a variable. Let's type public, then the name of our script, which is player movement, and then we need to give the variable a name. In our case, let's call it just movement. When we now save this and go into Unity, we can see that there's now an empty slot here. So by simply dragging our player movement script into that slot, we've now created a reference from the player collision script to the player movement script, and we've called this movement. Now in our code, we can replace our debug.log statement with movement.enabled, and we can set this to false. Again, let's save, hit play, and hit an obstacle. We can now see that our player movement script turns off. So that was pretty much it for this obstacle. We can now see that our player movement script turns.
Oh, nyambung ya. Berarti shared variable. Ini layar. Nggak ada player movement. Oh, public ya. Oke, player movement. Uncal ke sini. Oke, udah diuncal terus gimana? Movement. Oh, cari-cari off to enable flow. Oke, let's. Oh ya, kita di jalan lagi. Oke, nice. Buat enable disable script kali ya. Skip on another skip.
Save, hit play, and hit an obstacle. We can now see that our player movement script turns off. So that was pretty much it for this video. If you enjoyed it, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a future episode. Thanks for watching, and I will see you. Awesome people who donated in January, and a special thanks to Derek. In this video, we're going to be making some actual gameplay. Here's what it should look like when we're done. Awesome, so let's get started. So what we're going to be doing here...
Tes. Yang on berapa ibu? Ini apa caranya lihat ya? Satu sedang menonton. Ibu.
Is pretty much creating a level by hand using a bunch of prefabs. This allows us to really easily create interesting levels and fine-tune each part of the level to a good difficulty setting. The problem with this manual approach is that you cannot have infinite levels. You're going to have a start and an end point. If you want to create never-ending levels, I really suggest you watch my live stream on creating a dodge the blocks type game. In that video, we randomly spawn obstacles from a few spawn points. However, making things procedural is a bit more difficult. It does require some coding, and unless you are very skilled with it, it leaves you with very little customization when it comes to creating more deep and interesting levels. Anyway, let's take our obstacle and drag it into our project. What we just did was create a prefab of that obstacle. Prefabs are used whenever you want to have multiple objects of the same type. In our case, we want to have a lot of different obstacles in our scene. What we can now do is take this prefab from the project and drag it in anywhere into our scene. The cool thing is that if we now go to our obstacle and change our settings, say the size on the x-axis, you can see it updating on all of the objects at once. I'm just going to undo that. We can also edit one of these objects individually. Say select the first object here and change the mass. We can then go up here and hit apply, and it should now be applied to all the other prefabs. And we can see indeed the mass has changed on those as well. Remember to always hit apply whenever you've changed something on the prefab that you want to be applied to the others. Again, I'm going to put that back to 2 and hit apply. The first thing that we need to do is extend our ground plane. Currently we can go for a little bit and then we're going to fall off. Of course there are ways of making our ground plane follow the position of our player. One common thing to do when creating endless runners is not actually move the player, but instead move all of the obstacles and environment pieces closer to the player as the game progresses. This way we can actually just have a stationary ground element. But in our case we want to have some cool physics, and that looks much better if we move the actual player. So I think the solution here is as simple as just scaling up the ground. Let's take the ground, give it a scale on the Z of say 10,000, and let's also move it over on the Z. Let's set that to 4,980. That should make sure it begins in about the same place as our player. Now of course we can begin sketching out our level. There are a few things we can do to make that easier for us. The first one is getting the right view in the scene view. Notice how we have different axes up here. We can actually click on those to shift our view to that axis. So let's click on the Y. However, we're currently in perspective view. If we click on the center cube, we can switch to isometric. This flattens our entire scene and allows us to set up our level in kind of a 2D view. You can also go up here and disable stuff like skybox, fog, and flares. You can toggle all of those on and off by simply clicking the environment here. So I'm going to toggle those off. The grid I'm actually going to leave in here, but if you go under gizmos, you can disable that as well. We can also take our ground, go up to layer, hit add layer, and we can add a new layer called something like ground or environment. We can then take our ground plane and assign that layer. Now if we go up to the layers toggle, we can hit the log next to the environment. This now means that if we deselect our ground, we can't actually select it within our scene. We can still select it in the hierarchy of course, but it makes it so much easier to select the objects we want in our scene. So now we can delete our 2 obstacles here, take the first one and kind of move it forward a bit. If we drag on the green square here, it allows us to move it only in the X and Z position. You can of course go ahead and move these in freehand, but I prefer doing things on a grid. We can go edit, snap settings to configure how objects snap to the grid. I'm going to put 2 on the X, 2 on the Y, and 2 on the Z, and just leave scale and rotation as is. We can just close this now, and that means that if we now move this object and hold down Control, it's going to snap to every 2 units. Alright, so let's begin with this in the center, and then press Ctrl D or Command D if you're on the Mac to duplicate the object and move it over while holding down Control. And you can just repeat this process to create an interesting level. Alright, so you can see I've created a tiny bit of gameplay elements here. Of course I did this very quickly, and I'm not always the most creative when it comes to level design, but you get just how easy it is to place obstacles into our scene. You should of course pump this up with a bunch of different kind of objects. You can put collectible coins in here, obstacles that move back and forth, stuff to jump over or go beneath. There's plenty of opportunity, and the best thing about it is just how easily we can playtest it. Let's try and hit play and see how difficult this level is. The first thing that I'm noticing is that my controls feel really slow. Now that's not really a problem with the level, that's more a problem with our movement script. So let's see what we can do to edit that. Let's select our player and double click on our player movement. Now currently, in order to move our player forward, we're adding a force. And I think that works fine. But when moving to the right and to the left, it feels very non-responsive. That's because when adding a force to an object over time, it slowly builds up momentum. And when we then change direction, we have to wait for the object to build up enough force to do so. And this is where force modes come in. Unity actually allows us to specify in which way we should add a force. And we do that as a fourth parameter. First we have the force on the X, then we have the force on the Y, then on the Z, and finally we have the force mode. So let's put a comma here and let's input force mode dot. We can go through and read about what the different forces do. The standard one is force, which adds a continuous force to the rigid body using its mass. The one that we want is velocity change. This directly edits the velocity of the object and it completely ignores its mass. So make sure to add this to both of the add force statements. Let's now save and head back into Unity, and I know by experience that when using velocity change we need much smaller numbers. I think something around 100 should be fine. So if we now hit play, we can try that out. It already feels much more responsive, but I think it could be better. One thing we can do to make the movement feel more snappy is up the drag. Drag is basically air resistance. So the higher the drag, the more quickly our object is going to be stopped by air. That also means that we need to amp up our forces in order to move at the same speed, but it should make everything feel more responsive because the object is quicker to slow down. So let's up the drag to something like 1. Let's leave the same sideway force. Let's actually put our forward force up quite a bit. Let's try it out at 4,000. If we now hit play, everything feels so much better. I think this is a good forward force, and I think our controls feel really fluent. By the way, a cool shortcut is that you can play the game by hitting Control P or Command P if you're on the Mac. So the level already feels pretty fun. However, it's not too hard to see that this particular part is a bit too difficult. So let's just go in here and maybe add a tiny bit more distance between the first obstacle and the next one. And we'll do the same thing with these. Let's try it out again. Much better. The final thing that I wanted to add in this video is fog. Currently we can see all of the objects, no matter how far away they are. That's not too pretty, and it also makes the game feel a lot less interesting. The neat thing about this game is that it feels like the obstacles are coming out of nothing, and you never know what to expect. Well, we know, but the player shouldn't. So let's go under Window and select lighting. We can then take our lighting panel and dock it over here by the inspector and maybe give it a bit more space. There are a bunch of settings here to play around with. Stuff like the intensity of our ambient light, how to calculate shadows and reflections, and finally we have the fog. Let's go ahead and enable that. Let's also expand it. This allows us to set a color of our fog. You can choose pretty much any color you'd like and definitely get interesting with this, but I'm just going to go ahead and use the color picker to get the color of our background. That makes it feel like everything is blending in towards the sky. We can then up the density a bit. I'm gonna set it to something like 0.02. So now if we maximize our game view by hitting shift space, press play, we can see that our game actually starts to feel like a game. The level is currently really short though, so I definitely recommend creating something a bit larger. And again, you have most of the stuff in place here to create procedural levels. Don't
Like gimana itu like? Ikutin dulu deh.
Don't be scared to experiment. That was pretty much it for this video. If you enjoyed it, make sure to
Udah.
subscribe so you don't miss a future episode. Remember that if you get stuck on something, you can always go to forum.brackies.com. There's a lot of experienced developers there ready to
Sulit ya?
answer your questions.
Hehe. Iya nggak apa-apa. Orang belajar aja. Sulit. Suruh ngapain tadi? Oh, tadi bikin environment biar anu. Pertama itu ground dijadikan 1000. Terus ini positionnya harusnya juga 1000 dong. Apa 500? Apa bedanya? Kalau 1000 sama. Kalau 1000. Oh gitu. 490 kali ya. Jadi antara player itu nggak terlalu jauh. Terus scale Y sekali 2. Eh, groundnya di 25. Gua kebanyakan 60. Terus ground ini bikin layer. Nama layer. Ini nama layernya environment. Oke. Kalau sudah default sudah, ya apa cara nyimpannya? Udah. Terus layarnya environment. Nah, itu gini. Oh iya langsung. Oke. Terus oke, apa tadi caranya bikin multiply? Oh, cube ini jadi obstacle. Terus taruh sini. Jadi obstacle bisa banyak. Ketika obstacle-nya skill-nya diganti. Oh, nggak kelihatan kalau jadi. Iya kali. Enggak. Dia nggak berubah. Bohong. Oh, berubah. Oke, 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 sorry. Terus siapa caranya tadi? Bikin multiply.
To a good difficulty setting. The problem is you are very skilled with it, it leaves you with very little customization. Go to our obstacle and change now be applied to extend our ground plane. Currently we can go for a little bit and then we're going to fall off. Of course there are ways of making our ground plane follow 10,000. Let's also in perspective of those on and off thing like ground or invite the objects we want in a position. You can of course go ahead and move these now and on the Mac to duplicate the object and move it over while holding down control. And you can just repeat this process to create an interesting level.
Belum.
Leave scale and rotation as is. Go edit, snap settings to
Edit snaps. Oh, bikin obstacle dulu kali ya. Edit. Nah, snap setting. Wih, nggak ada, wih.
to configure how freehand, but I prefer to move it here. Take the first one and kind of move it forward a bit. We want in our scene. Square here, but I prefer doing things on a grid. We can go edit, snap settings to configure how objects snap to the grid. I'm going
Edit snap setting. Gak ada snap setting, Mas. Tahu di sini. Wah, nggak ada snap setting itu. Shortcut. Mana snap setting ya? Oke, tidur aja ibu. Ntar lagi udah juga. Makasih ibu.
to put 2 on the X, go position. You can of course go ahead and move these in freehand, but I prefer doing things on a grid. We can go edit, snap settings to configure
Edit snap setting. Gak ono. Ya aja di sini. Grid snapping has been snapping. If it's hidden, you can toggle visible overlay menu shortcut. Oh, ini. Oh, ini. Increment snapping. Dia bisa dipencet apa snapping tapi?
how objects snap to the grid. I'm going to put 2 on the X, 2 on the Y, and 2 on the Z, and just leave scale and rotation as is. We can just close this now, and that means that if we now move this object and hold down Control, it's going to snap to every 2 units. Alright, so let's begin with this in the center.
Oh gitu
Press
maksudnya.
Control D or
Enggak mana?
Command D if you're on the Mac to duplicate the object and move it over while holding down Control. And you can just repeat this process to create an interesting level.
Oke, delete first. Taruh. Control D. Aduh, susah banget. Lanang lu pinggir dah. Rapi banget
Alright, so
orangnya.
you can see I've created a tiny bit of gameplay elements here. I've tried a bunch of settings on. That makes it feel like creating brackies.com next. Feel like it makes the game these coming out of Collate. The neat thing about the game by hitting Control P or Command P if you're on the Mac. So the level already feels pretty fun. Cool actually prime speed, but the movement that when using velocity change, we
Oh ya,
adds
real
continuous
force mode ya.
force to the rigid body objects. Let's now
Itu ada di sini. Ke player. Aku harus ke player dulu. Ke player di player movement. Konstan ya, konstannya apa force mode? Kayaknya harus install. Harus install VS Visual Studio. Coba klik ini. Wih, kenceng banget. Wih, wih. Jadi ada perubahan kah?
let's select our player and double click on our player movement. Now currently right and time it's forced to add a one mode which adds this experience that would be fine. So if we now hit play
Oh, ada perubahan kecepatan. Aduh, aduh, belum kalah. Gini, kalah sama game sendiri. Tuh, 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 tuh. Oke, score dan UI.
Since the last video, a lot of you guys asked me how you can create some kind of score for the game. So that's what we're going to be making today. It also gives us the chance to play around with some Unity UI. Exciting stuff, let's get started. So let's begin by getting a bit more organized. First off, let's create a folder for all of our scripts. Let's name it scripts. We'll place our follow player, player collision, and player movement in there. Let's also make one for our materials. Again, we'll call this one materials and drag our obstacle mat and player mat in there. I think we can just leave the rest here.
Create folder. Scripts. Lawan materials. Sini. Terus ke sini. Sini ini apa ya? Langsung bisa. Langsung auto binding. Ayo, udah dulu deh, capek gua.